what the Labour Party would have to do when they lose the election.
When, as opposed to if.
Yes, is to look at the how they manage economies, because the history of the Labour Party is they get into power, they survive on the coattails of the previous Conservative government for 1 or 2 years, so things look quite good, and then their spending gets out of control, the economy tanks, they lose the election, and unemployment rises.
You see, I'm thinking about what's happened over the last few years. Hang on, 13 years, and there are going to be very few people who can look you in the face on the doorstep in Bognor and say, I'm better off than I was in 2010.
We have been through some major crises. Yeah. There's no question about that. COVID was a once-in-a-century crisis affecting this country and the world. We borrowed £450
billion. COVID is the new winter of discontent.
Well, we borrowed £450 billion, and we were able to borrow it because of the stewardship of the economy leading up to that point after the banking crisis. And the capital markets were confident enough to lend us £450 billion, and they know they're going to get it back. But because of that,
they weren't after Truss's budget in September.
I'm not saying that was a great triumph, but what I am saying is that Rishi Sunak is there, Jeremy Hunt is there. They're stabilising the economy. We did have the fastest growth in the G7 in 2021
but you don't now.
And 2022.
We've got the lowest now.
No, but we will recover. All the hallmarks, all the fundamentals are there in place. We've got low unemployment. We've got inflation coming down. We've got a competent government.
Inflation went up last month.
Yes, but it's forecast by the OBR to be 2.9% in the fourth quarter of this year.
Do you seriously believe that's going to happen?
I do, provided, of course, we don't give in to pay settlements where people are demanding 35% pay increases. Of course, that would blow inflation apart. But the point about we were discussing the Labour Party, I just think if the Labour Party lose the election, they've got to look at how they manage economies, because their history, throughout the history of the Labour Party, is the damage they do to the British economy.
Under the Blair government, the economy was well managed. I mean, then the financial crash came. I mean, we can argue about sort of things that we might have done differently, but it generally was well managed. The financial crash came along. Gordon Brown was seen by everybody outside this country as almost the saviour of the world economy. It doesn't really fit into your narrative.
Because, there was the banking crash, of course, but also the way they had spent during that period meant that when we came into office in 2010, we had a budget deficit, an annual budget deficit of £156 billion
What is it now?
It's
a lot more.
We have been through the COVID crisis and we're trying to deal with that. But that was 11% of GDP that we were spending in each year. We had to bring that down. And because of that, we were able to borrow during the COVID crisis.
Okay. Right, let's repeat the question. If the Starmer project fails and he doesn't win the general election, what next for Labour, Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, before I say that, just, Nick, I wonder which planet you're on at the moment, mate. I really do. Inflation, well over 12%. Food inflation, much more. More food banks in this country than branches
Jeremy,
of McDonald's.
you're taking your pen
Sorry,
right to the microphone.
It's a very good pen, given to me by a trade union. You're suggesting that somehow the economy is doing well. Well, if you ask anyone who is worse off than they were 10 years ago, ask anyone like a teacher or a rail worker, a mail worker, what's happened to their wages, they won't be very, very happy. And you cannot say that wages have caused this inflation, because wages have actually fallen over the last 10 years. And if you actually got round the table with all the unions involved in the current disputes and paid them properly, you would actually have more money being spent in the economy, which would help investment anyway, and you would have a lot less poverty around and a lot less people claiming universal credit or top-ups in order to get through. Now, for the Labour Party, I think the important thing is to offer a real alternative. And I saw an analysis in the I-paper last week which said one of the problems was many of the public don't fully understand what Labour's economic strategy is, because they're so busy presenting themselves as being very good at managing the economy. Surely we've got to look at the structural problems. The structural problems are historic lack of investment. Structural problems are historic lack of training, historic problems of underpayment of teachers and medical workers, many of whom, if they can, emigrate or they go and do something else, even though they've been trained at public expense.
You put forward that case in 2019.
I put forward that case in 2019.
Yep.
Of course we lost the election. I fully understand that. But there are many reasons, one of which was issues around Brexit, I'm sure you'd understand. But individually, interestingly, the policies, particularly ones on public ownership of mail, rail, water and energy, were actually all publicly supported and still are. I think what we need is a much clearer alternative in the election.
Is it also down to the fact that, I mean, there was a YouGov survey at the weekend which showed that undecided voters, who, as you well know, they decide elections generally, they much prefer Rishi Sunak to Keir Starmer. Now, what do you put that down to?
I think he puts himself across as being, was new, of course, which is what he is, but also he's probably trying to present himself as being financially and politically competent. I don't think he is, but it's an image that has been very carefully constructed over the last couple of months. But we are very early into his premiership.
Can I help?
I wouldn't know you can help me in a moment.
No, hang on a second. Hang on, because you just said you didn't think Keir Starmer was financially or politically competent.
No, I didn't say that.
You did say that.
I said the presentation of Sunak was that he was financially competent.
Right.
That's what I said.
I heard you to say that you didn't think Keir Starmer was financially or politically competent.
That is not.
Well, I'm glad to have given you the opportunity to clear that up, because was I alone in hearing that?
He's already been cancelled by Keir.
I thought that was going to be a great newsline, Jeremy. You've let me down.
I'm sorry to let you down on this. But my fundamental point is there has to be a real alternative offered. And if there isn't a real alternative offered, people go to the status quo. This is what they know.
A lot of your supporters and friends are really angry with Keir Starmer for effectively ditching all the promises that he made when he succeeded you, because his manifesto at that time, and there were 10 pledges, and they were all ones which I think you could have probably bought into.
They were all taken from the 17 and 19
and they've all
manifestos. All those 10 pledges were, and I was quite relieved, actually. Well, that's all right. My work has not been in vain, having got those two manifestos agreed by the party. Well, if we run away from what I believe were fundamental and reasonable policies to be offered to the British people. I mean, I was interviewed during the 2019 election by a Swedish journalist. He comes into my office, jumps in and says, "Right, Mr. Corbyn, tell me all about your extreme manifesto." So I sort of gave him a 2 or 3 minute description of what was in the policies. And he said, "Was that it?" I said, "Well, it's pretty good for this country." He said, "We did all that years ago. We've got stable economy, high living standards, good quality social services, good quality education, and a publicly run health service. Why don't you do the same?"
When he was elected leader, Keir Starmer on LBC described you as a friend. A few weeks ago, on LBC, he says that you were never a friend. When you hear him say things like that, does that...
Makes me sad, actually. I don't know why he says that. I mean, I worked with Starmer. He was in the shadow cabinet. I went to Brussels with him. Yeah, I worked with lots of people.
Did you regard him as a friend?
I regarded him as a colleague. I never regarded him as a friend. I didn't spend time hanging out with him, all that sort of thing. A friend is somebody go out for a meal with, have a chat, call their house, that thing now. So why he suddenly announced to the world I was a friend, and then a short time later announced I was not a friend, well, this is primary school stuff.